A whole bunch of different motorcycles here from different eras with a whole bunch of different mechanical and frame engine characteristics. Everything is different about almost every one of these bikes. I think what we ought to do is start off at what's pretty much current. This is a bike that you can still buy today. This is a bike that you could buy brand new in a showroom. This is a Triumph Speed Triple. It's over 1,000 cc's and probably makes about 130 horsepower. The bike is, by today's standards, is what you'd call trick. If you take a look, you can see inverted front forks. These are telescopic front forks that go up and down for your suspension. Inside the fork is fluid that is actually a shock absorber so that we can actually control how fast it goes up and down. We have disc brakes, one on either side. That's for good stopping power. We take a look at this engine. This engine is it's a liquid-cooled engine. We actually have a radiator for, same as we would with a car. We actually have an oil cooler down here below. There's a radiator for oil so that we can keep the oil cool inside the engine. This in itself kind of lets you know that this is one of the more performance motorcycles that you would find on the street today. So, seeing as we're at the front of motorcycles, let's take a look at the front of some of the other motorcycles here and go back in some time. If we take a look, here we can see a very old bike, and we can see how small the brake would be on this compared to the dual discs of that new bike. Here we have one small little brake, one little lever assembly. We squeeze the lever, hopefully we slow down. Certainly different than the what we have today. We take a look at the suspension. As we mentioned before, the new Triumph has telescopic tubes with hydraulic oil inside them for shock dampening. On this bike here, what we actually have is a very strong, solid, rigid style of suspension, but not telescopic per se. We actually have a little bit of movement up and down here and telescoping here. This, from the 1920s or the 1910s, is actually more advanced in many cases than this style, which is a girder style. Very strong, solid, somewhat heavy. We have a spring here that allows it to move up and down and take some of the bumps away from the driver being jostled around. However, what we find interesting is that while we have hydraulic oil inside the new motorcycle, this would be taking the place of oil, and all it is a little friction damper. Basically, you can wind it up or loosen it off for how fast you want the wheel to move up and down with a bump. While we're on the girder front end, I think it would be kind of nice to notice that on a lot of the brand new high-tech motorcycles, we have very expensive steering dampers. And these will be a hydraulic unit to help slow down any jostling of the steering. If we go back to the old days, here's our high-tech steering damper. And nothing more than a knob that you would turn. Again, some friction materials in here to slow down the steering. So we still have the same functions that would take place today in the old bikes in a totally different way. Steering damper, again, two knobs right in the center of the steering. You can see here an older bike that still has telescopic suspension. So of course we're mirroring things as we go along from girder to telescopic, and of course the inverted upside down forks, which supposedly is supposed to be lighter down here than the inverted way. So what you see here, while this tube's going up and down and this is all still, what's going up and down is lighter and it's smaller. Okay. If we take a look, and we're still comparing to the modern motorcycle, and we discuss this as being a liquid-cooled engine, same as our cars are. Go back in time, as we can see, we didn't have quite the sophistication in the old days. In many cases, nothing more than air running through the cylinder fins to cool down the engine. But with every ointment, there's a fly. You go back to the old Scott. Here's a motorcycle back from the 1915, 1910, 1920, in that era, with a radiator. So here we have a two-stroke motorcycle from the very old days. Has quite sophisticated suspension on it. It has a radiator, and it's a two-stroke, something that we don't see much anymore except in a racing circuit. Take a look at this bike. We actually have a gas tank. sitting here right in front of your seat. We got a gas tank, we have an oil tank, we have a radiator. Amazing. And of course, right next to her, we still have an air-cooled engine again, air-cooled engine, all the way down the line until we get to the more modern motorcycles. So here's a very old one with liquid cooling, and then we see the guy away from it. I'm going to actually mention here too that if we take a look at tire technology, we were talking about the old brakes and how small the brake was and pretty inefficient compared to today. If we take a look at this bike, and we're going back to the brand new one again, or the newer style, we can see ample braking. Along with that is the tire technology, so that when you're putting the brakes on, you don't go skidding down the road. The tire technology and the rubber technology today is so superior. In the old days, if we had tried having these brakes on one of those old bikes, the rubber would just skid down the road. So everything has evolved as time has gone on. You can see the style of the tires as time went on too, from a ribbed, quite thin tire. As time went on, we actually got into a little bit more beef, a little bit more rain dissipation. And of course, when we get to this style here, the grooves that are in the tire, they call them sipes. These are there to help to relieve some heat and some water. Okay, we talk about frames here. When you take a look at this motorcycle here, here we have an old bike actually sharing some technology with today. Or should we say that today's technology is sharing some technology from the old days. Here we have no shock absorbers like we do on many of the bikes of the 50s, 60s, and 70s had rear shock absorbers on the rear. These would control the wheel going up and down with springs. On this bike here, we see springs up underneath here. Something that you'll see from the Harley-Davidson Softails. Isn't that funny? We see lots of motorcycles that actually have, by today's standards, our springs and our shock absorbers are not exposed at all. We don't see them. On this bike here, they've hidden the springs. This is our shock absorber. This is the part that basically we use to adjust how fast the wheel will go up and then respond back down to the ground. Again, a friction style set of plates that rubs back and forth together, and we get to control how fast they move.
Yeah, right.
We look at some of these old bikes, and we take a look at the fact that some of the older bikes had absolutely no rear suspension at all. And in fact, the only suspension was spring on the seat. So it certainly is nice when you take a look at how hard that is. More of a racing style seat, not made for comfort. Certainly it did have some shock absorbers and some suspension, so you didn't get jostled around. In this case here, no suspension, just the seat. If we take a look and I walk through some of these bikes here, we can see different styles of comfort. Certainly this one here, some padding. This one, hardly any padding at all. They both have suspension though, thank goodness. And we get to our modern bike, of course, you can't see the suspension. It is tucked away, but of course it still shares the same kind of suspension style as this one, where you can't see it, it is there. It does allow the wheel to go up and down. It does have nice damping so we can adjust and slow down or speed up how fast we want the wheels to travel. And of course we have nice seats. Not only do we have a nice seat, we have a seat that raises itself for the passenger, so the passenger actually gets a little bit of a view from behind the driver. And passenger pegs fold down so that the passenger can actually put their feet somewhere, fold them up so that the lone driver doesn't have to keep stabbing himself in the hip. So here we have the fold down passenger pegs, something of course that's been shared for many years, and we can still see that from our what we call our pillion seat for the passenger. And even in these days, we still had fold-down passenger pegs. So, with that said, it looks like on the side of here we have possibly some toolbox areas here. That's almost like the built-in steel saddlebags, but not for very much. Maybe some tools.